Are you talking, Shir? Are you talking right now?
Hi, yeah.
Oh, yes, yes.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Geshe. I want to remind everyone that. Sorry, oh, I hear myself double. Oh. So I want to remind everyone that the activity of Dharma Friends of Israel is done all voluntary, and you can contribute using the link in the PayPal. I'm pasting it now in the chat. Also, I'm pasting now in the chat a text that we will use today. So you can download it from there. It will be available also on the site for next week, but for now you can download it from the chat. So thank you very much, and Yeshima, you can continue.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so let's start with the most important beginning, setting our motivation. And before we can do that, to calm the mind, we'll do a few moments of breathing and then we'll continue the way we usually do. And now, in order to take refuge effectively, let's visualize the object of our refuge in the space in front of us in the form of, first of all, Buddha Shakyamuni, who appears as an embodiment of great compassion and wisdom in the form of a fully ordained monk. And his ability to lead us to the enlightened state. And who's inseparable from your personal Lama. Surrounded by the great Indian masters, Nagarjuna, Ayurdeva, Buddhapalita, Bhavaviveka, and so forth. As well as the great Tibetan masters, Milarepa, Mapa, Sakyapandita, Lama-Tsongkhapa, and so forth. Think that all these great masters are once again inseparable from your personal teacher, your personal Lama. And then all around us, think that they're all sentient beings, all suffering, living beings. Who, out of confusion, experience numerous different afflictive emotions, giving rise to their different types of pain, fear, and other sufferings. And that's thus generate a feeling of closeness towards these endless sentient beings and a sense of affection. Based on the understanding that essentially they're just like us. And from that sense of closeness, generate the wish, may they be free from all their sufferings and all their limitations, their confusion. And may I be able to protect them from whatever is keeping them in cyclic existence. And then that wish becomes stronger. It turns into a determination. I will work towards freeing these sentient beings from all their problems, all their pain. And the causes that give rise to these unwanted experiences. However, since my mind right now is limited, is obstructed by my own afflictive emotions, I therefore first have to become a Buddha myself. Therefore generate the determination, I will become a Buddha. I will do all I can to reach that enlightened state for the welfare of all suffering sentient beings. And with this motivation, I will also study Chandrakirti's text today. Try to really feel that from the depth of your heart, that determination. And without losing your motivation, let's recite the prayers. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then the 7 limbs. And for that, again, remember the front visualization, the Buddha and all the other masters. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time. And rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence. And turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. Okay, all right. Well, having done the preparation, setting the motivation, once again throughout this week, we'll just keep on forcing it as in like hanging in there with bodhicitta, however difficult it may be. But for this week in particular, I'd ask you to generate bodhicitta over and over again, especially when you face some problem, when you face some difficulty, when you have fear, or you have problems with other people, different situations, stressful situations, to note, okay, there's a problem, I'll deal with that. But more importantly, I dedicate myself towards the welfare of sentient beings. in a way to kind of step away from it and feel, okay, there's a problem. I need to deal with it and I will. But almost a sense of letting go, since that just concerns myself usually, or that which is mine, my family, and so forth, and kind of take this step back and remind yourself, well, for the welfare of all sentient beings, that is my main goal. I'll deal with it, but my main goal is this. Okay, so for this week, especially when there are problems, as often as you can, again, the same idea, wake up in the morning, first thing, generate bodhicitta. Last thing, you go to sleep, bodhicitta. Okay, it's the best you can. If you want to support this deep feeling, and that's important to generate a sincere feeling. It should not just be, well, coming from the mouth, as in just repeating these words, but to really deeply feel it, have that sense of, I really will do this. I have this opportunity in this life. I have this incredible mind, and then generate that sense from deep within you. And in order to be able to do that, to remind you, as in reading, for instance, the 8 verses, His Holiness this morning gave the teachings on these 8 verses. Read Shantideva's text, the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, and whatever else inspires you. All right. And then doing that again and again, remind yourself. And as I said, in particular, when you face a problem, when you're upset with another person, when you face fear and worry, any kind of problem, a problem that arises, in that moment, remember bodhicitta. Just generate the mind of enlightenment or the mind of bodhicitta. Okay, so this is for the method aspect, but of course, we've now started the wisdom aspect, and we've already discussed the 4 extremes. Actually, we'll come next time, we'll definitely start with refuting the production from something that is inherently other. And then taking it from there, we'll discuss the true truth. And then there are going to be more topics that you're probably more familiar with. So right now, it's still a little bit abstract. We've already heard about this debate I mentioned last time, and this time I prepared a handout, a short handout, just to summarize this debate. You can see it right in front of you. What does Bodhapalita say? What does Bhava Viveka say? And then in that way, hopefully, when you have something written right in front of you, it's easier to follow the debate. But it gives you a good sense of how these kind of debates take place. What is the logic they apply? How something is logically presented to another person. And His Holiness was this morning, if you followed the teachings, His Holiness, once again, and His Holiness stresses this frequently, how important is the appliance of logic, applying logic, using logic in order to understand the Buddhist teachings. And this debate actually shows us to do so. But before we go into this, you see, I've talked about these extreme views, and one extreme view is the view of the Samkhya school. Now, the way I presented to you the Samkhya school, to be honest, was not really, strictly speaking, the whole explanation. I didn't present it to you with everything there is to the Samkhya school, which of course we wouldn't have time. I wouldn't be able to do it anyway because of all the details. I don't know all the details. I only know what we studied as part of Buddhist studies. But there's a little bit more I'd like to present to you now. And the reason why I didn't tell you all that I'm going to tell you now is because I wanted to first find a way that you can relate to what these philosophers of the Samkhya school assert when it comes to how something comes into existence. That we can relate this view that they hold as an intellectually acquired view. It's something that, it's a philosophy that they basically created over a certain period of time, dependent on a teacher who kind of came up with this philosophy that made a lot of sense to these followers of the Samkhya school. However, with every intellectually acquired view, there's always an inborn sense. There's an inborn sense that we share with everyone, well, with every human being having a similar type of, well, let's say human intelligence. And so this kind of view, to first get in touch with that so we can relate to this to a certain degree. This is why, for instance, the Tibetans, they kept this explanation of the Samkhya school, although in Tibet, there were no Samkhya followers, there were no philosophers of the Samkhya school, and nonetheless, they preserved this because they felt there was an importance with regard to this view. In that, we have a sense that if a sprout, if an apple tree arises from a particular seed, there must be some connection between the seed and that apple tree, and there must be something present within the apple seed. And usually we call that the potential to give rise to the apple seed. But allow for this sense of a potential of an apple seed. How does that up for an apple tree, this potential to give rise to an apple tree, how does that actually arise to your mind? What kind of sense, what does that potential look like? What does a potential mean anyway? It's just this word that sounds pretty fancy, but what does it actually mean? How does it appear to your mind? And we'll come to see there's a sense there is already something there. There's some nature, possibly a miniature apple tree already present in that seed, whichever way it appears to our mind. And that's the way we usually perceive of it, the way we apprehend this potential to exist. I mean, potential is just something we apply. It's like a name we impute, but it's, to us, it's not just imputed based on the fact that from that seed, eventually an apple tree arises. For us, there seems to be much more. There seems to be some intrinsic nature to that seed. And I guess that kind of sense that there's already something present in the seed, that gave rise to the Samkhya's assertion, kind of spelling it out, building upon this inborn view that there must be already something there. So what the Samkhya schools, just in a few words, assert that there's some general underlying nature, prakriti they call it, or in Tibetan, it's called the kinds of principal nature, the principal factor or whatever. It's like an underlying kind of entity, if you like, that is non-manifest and that gives rise to all the effects. That's really what they assert. So that in the seed, within the seed, there is this general nature that is inseparable from the sprout or from the apple tree, and that therefore the apple tree arises from that entity which is non-manifest, which is inseparable from the apple tree. So in a way, therefore, it arises from itself, from its own nature, which is actually this underlying prakriti, or this underlying nature. Again, it's not really important to understand the Samkhya school in all its details, in particular, since we don't follow this particular philosophical system, but it's more about understanding what is the origin of their view, and then find it within ourselves, the sense there's already something there. All right. Having done that, having said that, and there's a lot more to it, of course, that talk about Purusa and the pure consciousness together with this Prakriti giving rise to these phenomena, but all these details we don't need here. We can find a lot of explanations in the Tibetan texts. The Tibetans were great. The Tibetan masters were very skillful in preserving whatever they had learned about the Samkhya school, like many of the Indian Tibetan masters who went to India to learn there, to translate the texts, but also from the Indian masters who had learned about the Samkhya school, for instance, and brought their understanding to Tibet. So the Tibetans did a great job to talk about the Samkhya school in a brief way, just the kind of main details, and preserve it there for over 1,000 years. And nowadays we've got the internet, and you can actually Google the Samkhya school, and here the sources are from Indians, from Indian philosophers, not taken from the Tibetan text. And it's incredible how the explanation they're giving these Indian sources is the same as what the Tibetans tell us. Of course, it's done in Tibetan, but the explanation is not that different. So over 1,000 years, the Tibetans were able to preserve even that knowledge of a non-Buddhist philosophical school, that they had made part of their own philosophy, in that it helped them to understand their own view better. Okay. Now, what I discussed last time already was, at this point, after we talked, and we can leave these verses behind us now, we got up to verse 13. I described this debate between Buddhapalita, Baba Viveka, and Chandrakirti. This really famous debate that, well, in the institutions where you learn how to debate, in the monasteries, the nunneries, and other institutions, you study this particular topic for over a month, sometimes even longer. You debate it. It's very extensive. It's less difficult rather than complicated. So it's not like really deep and hard to understand, but rather it's complicated. But it's still very helpful because it clearly lays out the way in how we can learn, how we can logically understand something. It describes that process to a certain degree. It gives us a good sense of how a debate took place. And it also explains to us what is the difference between the Svatantrika Madhyamika and the Prasangika Madhyamika. All right. So since it is not part of the text, it's not mentioned as part of any of the verses. Like I said, I put some material together. It's only 2 pages, so maybe we could read it together. Shir, if you could show the material. I'm hoping not to put you off too much with it because it is kind of complicated, but well, hopefully it's clear enough, and I won't. Well, you won't lose the plot, as in like it makes sense to you to such a degree that you'll won't get lost in what is explained here. So first of all, there's the debate between, okay, Buddhapalita, Baba Viveka, and Chandrakirti. Though strictly speaking, of course, Buddhapalita just sets forth his explanation, and then Baba Viveka kind of attacks him, not attacks him in the literal sense of the word, but logically kind of refutes him, disagrees with him. And then later on, Chandrakirti comes along and disagrees with Baba Viveka and defends Buddhapalita. Okay, so here it says these 3 masters each composed a commentary on the root text on wisdom, which is the fundamental wisdom, or as it's also called, the treatise on the middle way. Both names apply. So Nagarjuna's text, as Honda spoke about it this morning, briefly mentioned that this is the root text. This is the main text that we follow when it comes to emptiness. And so their explanations, these 3 masters, each composing a commentary. So Buddhapalita, he composed a commentary which is called Buddhapalita. It's like, that's the name. It's also described as a commentary on the fundamental wisdom, but then the name that is given to the text is the same as the author. So probably the author didn't give this name to the text. He maybe just called it a commentary on the treatise on the middle way, on the fundamental wisdom. And then other people, to differentiate it from other commentaries, called it the text Buddhapalita. Anyway, so he composed that text. Baba Viveka composed a text called the Lamp of Wisdom. Did not mention that here. I think I described it here. Anyway, so Lamp of Wisdom. And then Chandrakirti composed 2 commentaries on Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom. I mentioned this before, but maybe you've forgotten. He wrote 2 commentaries, which are both really important. One is called a word commentary. It's the literal meaning in Tibetan is a word commentary, which explains literally the words. It describes, or it basically, well, explains all the words of the fundamental wisdom, each verse, in other words, literally explains what each verse means. While the other text is the entry into the, so that's called clear words. And then there's the entry into the middle way, the text we study, and that explains the meaning of the fundamental wisdom. Now, here, Chandrakirti defends Buddhapalita against Baba Viveka's criticism in his clear words. All right, this is why you can't find this debate in the entry into the middle way, since Chandrakirti didn't talk about it. But nonetheless, all the masters of Tibet, definitely in the Gelugpa tradition, found this debate important enough that it was mentioned as separate from the study of the entry into the middle way. Okay, so there are explanations on the first chapter of the Fundamental Wisdom, which refutes the Samkhya view that an effect is produced from a cause that is the same nature or the same entity as the effect, reveals the difference between the Svatantrika Madhyamika school, which Baba Viveka accepts, and the Prasangika Madhyamika school that Buddha Palita and Chandrakirti assert. So Svatantrika Madhyamika school, Baba Viveka followed this school, and the Prasangika Madhyamika school, the school that Buddha Palita and Chandrakirti followed. Now, actually, the Prasangika school is the highest school. However, it's so difficult to understand. And the Svatantrika school, although it's not the highest school, really helps us to understand the Prasangika school better. So we need both schools, or it's helpful to learn about both and understand the difference. So then this debate, therefore, it makes this difference clearer. And the debate consists of first Buddha Palita's reasoning, refuting the Samkhya position, which is this position that the seed, the sprout is already present in the seed. In other words, the effect is already present in the cause because it's this nature. It has risen from that nature, and that nature is not inseparable from the sprout. So it's arisen from itself. If it comes down to, it boils down to it rising from itself, therefore. And so Buddha Palita first refutes this. Then Baba Viveka criticizes Buddha Palita's reasoning, and Chandrakirti defends Buddha Palita. So that therefore Buddha Palita's reasoning is defended by Chandrakirti. Okay. Now, first Buddha Palita's reasoning. Buddha Palita says in his commentary on Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom, there is no production of things from themselves because their production would be senseless, meaningless, pointless, and because absurd consequences would follow, which are a thing that exists in its own entity has no need for production. If it were produced, even though it already existed, it would never be not produced. So that was the reasoning we heard before. Well, if it already exists, now this is, you see, the thing is, it kind of, you would probably say, well, but the Samkhyas don't really say that, do they? They don't. They say it's arisen from this nature that is present in the cause. They're not saying the sprout is already really present there, right? They're not really literally saying that. It's almost like the Buddhists are kind of saying, this is what you say. And they would say, no, but we don't say that. However, this process that you witness here, that is a process in which if you imagine Buddhists and Samkhyas come together and debate. They debate. And they spend some time together. And so here in particular, and we're saying this debate is actually not really meant for a Samkhya person. It's rather for someone who has an interest in Buddhist ideas, but kind of holds views that are similar to the Samkhya view. And we've already heard in terms of an inborn sense that the result is already present in the cause, we all share that. So in that sense, we're these Samkhya people in the sense that if we studied this view, if we showed some interest in that view, I'm sure we'll understand it. Out of this instinctive sense, there must already be something there within the seed. And so taking that and now taking the Buddhist view, the Buddhists would then argue, well, if you believe this to be the case, that the seed contains already something of the sprout, well, if you say that, you're really saying that it's inseparable from that sprout. So in a way, the sprout is already there. And since the sprout is already there, why does it need to be produced a moment later to become the sprout? It's already in the seed. That would be one consequence, as here described by Buddha Palita. And moreover, although within the seed you already have the sprout, I mean, that would be the absurdity from this view. If you were to say that the sprout exists already within the seed and still it is produced again, well, then it would be again produced and again produced. Why? That would be endless production. Well, why? Because its existence does not prevent it from being produced again. The existence of the sprout does not prevent it from being produced again and again and again. So it would be endless. That's what he says here with these words. And so with these words, Buddhapalita sets forth two logical statements, two consequences. First of all, regarding the subject functioning things. It follows, so with regard to functioning things, it follows that it would be senseless to produce them again because they would already exist at the time of their cause. So why do you produce them again if the seed already, sorry, if the sprout already exists, if the apple tree exists already within in the seed, why produce it again? It doesn't make sense. It's meaningless. It's pointless. That would be the absurdity. Of course, the Samkhya's don't go like, yeah, right away. But if they think about it, well, if it's already there, why would you produce it again? And secondly, the same subject, the same basis, functioning things, it would follow that they're never not produced. And so the production is endless. Why? Because even though they already exist at the time of their cause, they have to be produced again. And so it means they have to be produced again and again and again. Why not? So it's an endless process. All right. So that's what we've heard before. This is how these verses, Chandrakirti's verses, were explained to us. And of course, Chandrakirti explained them based on what Nagarjuna said, based on what Buddhapadita said. So no surprise that we hear the same thing again. But now there's Baba Viveka. There's this great master. I mean, even though we don't agree with him, it doesn't mean that he was not a supreme, superior master who set forth the Buddhist teachings, well, explained them, practiced them, of course, himself, set them forth. But they didn't set forth the highest view, which, of course, again, is helpful for us because learning his view is kind of a stepping stone, helping us to understand the deeper and more difficult view of the Prasangika school. Therefore, why do they study this? Because it helps us. I mean, it's not like, in the end, we could say, well, who cares about Buddha Baba Viveka? That he doesn't teach the highest view. But the masters of the past have understood learning this helps us to come closer to understanding the deepest view. It takes time, it's difficult. It's a process of not just understanding better, but also of making our mind more flexible, making our mind more flexible. It seems bizarre. I remember the first time I heard this expression, one of my teachers used it, like saying you might make your mind more flexible. And I never forgot that way of putting it because it's so true. It's like when you do physical exercise, I think it was Geshe Damdu actually who said it. When you do physical exercise, just as your body, every time you do it, it becomes a little easier, a little easier. Like think of yoga or stretching or whatever you do. Every time you do it, it becomes a little easier. It becomes a little easier. You become more flexible. Your body becomes more flexible. The same applies to your own mind. You think about it once, it's hard. Your mind is rigid. It doesn't really make sense. The words don't make sense. You hear it twice, you hear it 3 times, and every time your understanding deepens and deepens and deepens. So this is what this helps us to actually this process takes place through understanding also this debate as part of it. Okay, so hopefully this becomes clear reading through it how this is the case. Now, what does Baba Viveka do? He analyzes Buddhapalita's reasoning, right? Buddhapalita was a great master who lived before Baba Viveka, and he left behind this text. And Baba Viveka studied it, he analyzed it. And in his lamp of wisdom, he finds 3 faults with what Buddhapalita said. Okay, so first of all, Buddhapalita says, Baba Viveka says Buddhapalita fails to provide a correct reason and an example that are parts of an autonomous syllogism, able to refute the view that things are produced from themselves. Okay, so what is he saying? Previously, Buddhapalita, he cited consequences. What are consequences? It gives them away. When you use the word it follows, it follows. That's already a word that is used in a consequence. It's not used in a syllogism. It follows basically means the absurdity, the consequence of what you said, the absurd consequence of what you said is this, that, and the other. So I mentioned this before. You point out the absurdity, the inner contradictions that arise if you assert something absurd. You just kind of bring out these absurdities. Now, I've mentioned this before. This is a system of reasoning that is most seen to be most effective in the Prasangika Madhyamika school, in the highest school. And it makes sense. It's like you put yourself into the other person's shoes, as in like saying, all right, let's assume what you say is right. So it's not like saying you're wrong. That's kind of patronizing. That's kind of creating a distance. What you're saying is wrong because. That's not what you're saying. In order to understand another person, you put yourself on their level. You on their level, as in like put yourself into their shoes. First, try to understand where they're coming from. It's all part of compassion. It's part of compassion. What you do when you practice compassion, you put yourself into the other person's shoe. Try to understand where they're coming from. Try to understand their problems, their confusion, and generate the wish to be free from it and the wish to protect them from that suffering. That is the method aspect. But that same way in which you put yourself into the other person's shoe in order to generate methods such as love and compassion, you also do so in the process of helping another person to gain a correct understanding. And it helps you yourself to gain that understanding. So, again, you can do it also with yourself. If that were true, what I'm assuming, then this would follow, this would follow. You can do it with yourself, but you can definitely do it also with another person. You do that in the debate, for instance. So, in the debate, in the exchange with another person, where sometimes it seems the other person is wrong, but the funny thing is that every time you debate with another person, you also learn so much from it, even though you are the person who may know better, has a better understanding, but the view of the other person always makes it clearer to you. Or just the fact that you have to logically kind of present the other person the absurdities and contradictions, you learn so much from just that. But in this context, in particular in the Prasangika school, this is seen as the way to gain understanding. It's again this idea, you put yourself into this situation, you really imagine that to be true, and then take it from there. Understand that this absurdity occurs, that contradiction would arise, and so forth. And since it's like you come across all these barriers, as in, like, if that were really true, this would be absurd, and that would be absurd, and so forth, you willingly able to give it up. It's much easier to give it up because we're attached to our own views. It's oftentimes hard to let go of them, not only because we don't understand the opposite, but also we hold on to them very strongly. So it's very complicated why we hold certain views. And so to give them up, it's much easier to do so if we understand how it harms us, how it's so not in accordance with reality. And again, this also reminds me of renunciation, which is different. Renunciation is letting go of our attachment to cyclic existence, but only because we see the disadvantages of engaging in this activity and that activity, how it's limited, how it's not giving us the happiness that we're looking for, and so forth. So renunciation is a very natural process where at some point you see all the disadvantages of ordinary worldly life and you can just naturally let go. It's just a natural, I don't want this, I don't need this. That's renunciation. It's not forcing yourself to do something you don't want to do. And likewise here with coming to the correct view of reality, what you do is see all these contradictions until you go, oh no, it really doesn't make sense. And then it's easy, relatively easy to let go. Okay. So it's not of someone imposing their view on you, but we have a sense. Usually we have a sense we can gain an understanding if another person tells us something. That's our first view. Okay, there's this view, and you find this also in other religions that we can come to an understanding if the Buddha just tells us things are impermanent. But that's not enough. If the Buddha tells us things don't lack inherent existence, that's not enough. We need to come. This is just the first step. Then we need to think about this. We need to make this our own. We need to reflect on this over and over again. But hearing that once and thinking about it again, that's not enough. As I said, to hear that things don't exist inherently because they're dependently arisen, that is nice and it helps to a certain degree. But more helpful is to think what it would mean if things existed inherently, for as an example. Okay. Now, having said all this, Buddhapalita holds this view that these consequences, they're not effective. You need a correct view. You need a logical statement telling you things don't arise from themselves because. Okay, he holds this view. So that's the difference between Buddhapalita of the Svatantrika school and Bhava Viveka of the Svatantrika school and Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti of the consequentialist or the Prasangika school. So following different methods in terms of understanding. So Buddhapalita, here Bhava Viveka says Buddhapalita fails to provide a correct reason and an example that are parts of an autonomous syllogism able to refute the view that things are produced from themselves. Okay, the example I'll explain in a minute. It'll become clearer. You will see Bhava Viveka's syllogism that he cites as an alternative, and a correct reason, well, saying A is B because of C. Okay, A is B because of C. Well, C is here the correct reason. All right. So you need this reason. You need to prove that things are not produced from themselves because a consequence is not enough. And you need an example. And these are all parts of a syllogism that, according to Bhava Viveka, must be autonomous and therefore is able to refute the view that things are produced from themselves. The reason for this criticism is that Bhava Viveka does not find Buddhapalita's consequences adequate. He can't do anything with them. He doesn't find them adequate. He wants a reason. He wants a syllogism. And now he seeks to reconstruct them. He takes those syllogisms before, and based on Buddhapalita's words, he kind of reconstructs them in the form of a syllogism. Buddhapalita didn't cite a syllogism at all, but Bhava Viveka tries very hard to find one in his words. So as claimed by Bhava Viveka, logically there could be only the following syllogism that Buddhapalita cited. Of course, Buddhapalita never said that, but that's Bhava Viveka's interpretation. So Bhava Viveka thinks logically it would only make sense that Buddhapalita, with his words, said regarding the subject functioning things such as seeds and sprouts and so forth, they're not produced from themselves because production is sensible. It has a sense, it makes sense, and it has an end. It's not endless. You see, he takes the opposites of what was previously said, claiming that functioning things, it follows that they don't make sense and have no end, that they're endless because they're produced from themselves. And here he just turns it around. He turns it around. He takes the opposite of previously saying they're produced endlessly, or the opposite of it's senseless to produce them, takes the opposite and say it is sensible and there is an end to it, and therefore they're not produced from themselves. So this is the syllogism he cites. Okay, but this is really not what Buddhapalita is saying. He's not saying that at all. According to Bhava Viveka, Bhava Viveka believes this to be the case. He says, okay, this is the syllogism that Buddhapalita cites, but he still says it's not a correct syllogism because this reason, what is the reason? Production is sensible and has an end. It's not able to refute the Samkhya position. Right, yeah, of course, why, how could that refute the Samkhya position? Buddhapalita would agree, but he says, I never recited that syllogism in the first place. Okay, so the reason is not able to refute the Samkhya position, nor does it provide an example. Yeah, okay, that doesn't say anywhere, for example. That's true, doesn't say that. That is part of a correct syllogism. Hence, Bhava Viveka cites the following syllogism that he believes to be free from these faults. So now he provides his own syllogism. Regarding the subject, the inner sense sources, such as an eye sense source, an eye sense power, So these sense sources, they're not ultimately produced from themselves because they exist. Okay, how is that any better? But okay, he insists, yeah, because they exist, therefore they're not produced from themselves. Basically, with this ultimately, later on, Chandakirti, and this is not part of his main criticism, Chandakirti said, why do you say ultimately? You don't need to say ultimately. No, there's not even a conventional production from themselves. So you don't need to say ultimately. You don't need to add that. But this is not that important here. So let's leave that criticism. But just saying, okay, so they're not produced from themselves because they exist. Okay, so that reason is so much better. Okay. Like, for example, consciousness. So he gives an example saying, well, since consciousness exists, it is not produced from itself either. And in that same way, you can understand the subject, these inner sense sources, since they are not, since they exist, they're also not ultimately produced from themselves. This is really what the syllogism says. So understanding that if something exists, it cannot be ultimately produced from themselves, which is just another way of saying they're not ultimately produced from themselves because they exist. So since they exist, they're not ultimately produced. First, you understand that on the basis of consciousness, which consciousness is not produced in the Samkhya system, it's not produced anyway, it always exists. So they say, well, since it exists, it's not produced, so it can't be produced from itself. And he uses that then to say, well, that's true for the sense sources. Okay, that's what he says. So Bhavaviveka has this very simplified way of looking at things, believing, saying that is enough, which Buddhapalita, nor Chandakirti would agree that to be sufficient. So basically what we've learned is Bhavaviveka says Buddhapalita cites a syllogism here because we always need a syllogism, and without syllogism, it's not possible. But that's actually not true. And so the syllogism that Bhavaviveka comes up with, Buddhapalita never mentioned, plus his criticism that this syllogism that supposedly Buddhapalita recited, well, it doesn't contain a reason, has no example. Well, okay, that's his criticism. And so Bhavaviveka gives another syllogism, which, as we can see, doesn't seem to help much more. Okay, so that's the first criticism. I think we can kind of follow it to a certain degree. The next criticism by Bhavaviveka is Buddhapalita's supposed reasoning is further, in general, is not able to really provide a correct reason. It's not able to refute the Samkhya view. But even further, if you go into analysis of what the Samkhyas really hold, if they analyze, then also it's not able to get rid of the Samkhya's mistaken view. After the Samkhyas have analyzed the meaning of the thesis that things are not produced from themselves. Because like if you say to the Samkhyas, things are not produced from themselves, what does that mean to the Samkhya person? So if they analyze that further, so based on this analysis, again, Bhavaviveka says Buddhapalita cannot disprove the Samkhya view. Okay. So a follower of the Samkhya school, of course, would question what production from self or production from its own nature means, because those are Buddhist words kind of saying, well, if you're a follower of the Samkhya say that, that's what it would follow. It would mean something is produced from itself. So if they now analyze what that really means, it could mean either that an effect, such as the sprout, is produced from a sprout from itself that is manifest at the time of the cause. Okay, so let's say there's only two ways, and this is how the Samkhya's kind of look at it. They talk about being manifest, being manifestly recognizable, and not being manifestly there. So it's almost like, yeah, this sprout is in the seed, but it's not manifest. It's in there, but we can't perceive it. We can't perceive it. That means it's not manifest. And then the other way would be that it's already in there. It's already manifestly in there. Okay, so now Bhavaviveka says, it gets a little confusing because both names start with a B and they're really long kind of names. But anyway, Bhavaviveka says, not only does Buddhapalita cite, does Buddhapalita provide a syllogism, which actually he doesn't, but Bhavaviveka thinks so. He provides, not only does Buddhapalita provide a syllogism that lacks a reason, that lacks an example, that is able to produce production from self, on top of that, if the Samkhyas were to really analyze the meaning of production from self, if they really were to go into more detail, this reason and this, well, this syllogism is even less able to prove anything. That's what Bhavaviveka says. So it's just number two. The second criticism is just a more extensive version of number one, if you like. So a follower of the Samkhya school now, when you say production from self doesn't exist, does that mean, if production from self existed, does that mean the sprout is produced from a sprout that is already really visible at the time of the cause, the seed? Well, the Samkhyas would say no. They would agree with Buddhist philosophers if that's what it means. If it were to say that the sprout is already totally visible in the seed, that therefore that this is not possible, the Samkhyas would agree. They would say, no way, the sprout is already, the apple seed is not visible in the seed. The seed is tiny and the apple seed is really huge. So they wouldn't say that it's manifest in the seed. They would agree with Buddhist philosophers that the sprout is not produced from itself, right? If that's what it means to be produced from itself, that is already really there, then the Samkhyas would agree. And this would mean that Nagarjuna, Buddhapalita, and so on prove something that is already established for the Samkhyas, making their reasoning redundant. Makes sense, right? Of course, it makes sense. So if production from self meant that, the reasoning would be redundant. It would not be necessary, because that's not what the Samkhyas agree to. But if it means that the sprout is produced from a sprout that is not manifest at the time of its cause, it's not manifestly there, it's not something that is visible, it's just in the form of a potential, or even more precisely, getting closer to the view of the Samkhyas, that the sprout is produced from a non-manifest nature, like prakriti, like this non-manifest nature that the Samkhyas assert that exists at the time of that seed or the cause. Buddhapalita's reason would prove exactly the opposite for a Samkhya. For Samkhya, they would hold that since production makes sense and has an end, things are necessarily produced from a non-manifest nature or non-manifest entity that exists at the time of their cause. So basically, what Bhavaviveka says, that Buddhapalita, in the first case, you didn't have to cite the reason because the Samkhyas, they agree with that. And in the second case, well, they would never agree to this. They would always say, they would not let go of their view, in other words. So that's what Bhavaviveka here argues. He's saying, he's just strengthening his criticism, his first criticism. He's taking it further and saying, no matter what you do, the reason that Buddhapalita gives is not able to disprove the Samkhyas. It's really like a more extensive version of the first criticism. And then number three, the third criticism, he says that Buddhapalita's consequence. So he believes that this consequence he cites, he's aware of this consequence, but that this consequence has to be reversed. And he spells it out here, that it has to be reversed, that the consequence, production, would be senseless and endless. That has to be reversed in order to cite the reason of a correct syllogism. What is the reason? What is the opposite of production would be senseless and endless? Is production is sensible and has an end. That is the reason of the syllogism that Bhavaviveka thinks Buddhapalita cited. So in the same way as that must be reversed in order to cite the syllogism, the supposed syllogism, which of course Buddhapalita never cited. So in the same way as you have to turn that around, you have to turn around things are not produced for themselves. So the reason of the consequence, remember, what did he say? It follows that production would be senseless when endless because things are not produced from, because things are produced from themselves. That's the reason of the consequence. Now, things are not produced from themselves. So the things are produced from themselves. When you reverse that, So when you reverse the consequence, things are not produced from themselves. It must be, sorry, that there's a mistake there. Things are produced from themselves. It should be here. Likewise, the reason of the consequence, things are produced from themselves. So the not should be, yeah, this not is not supposed to be there. If you can just uh, kind of get rid of it. Things are produced from themselves. So the opposite of that would be things are not produced. And here Buddha Palita thinks if you negate things are produced from themselves, if you negate that, you get things are produced from others. If you negate production from self, from something from themselves, then if you refute that, if you take the opposite that you need to do in order to get a syllogism. So Buddha Palita believes if you have a consequence, that consequence needs to be changed around in such a way that you can cite a correct syllogism. And that syllogism is always the opposite of the parts of the predicate. So it's always, so whatever you cited as the predicate, what is the predicate? In the case of the syllogism, functioning things, it follows that their production is endless because they were produced from themselves. Okay, because they were produced from themselves, you take the opposite, being not produced from themselves, that becomes the predicate. So the same subject, the same basis regarding the subject functioning things that are not produced from themselves because it makes sense to produce them. Okay, so you just turn them around. You take the reason of the consequence, take the opposite of that, and cite that as the predicate of the syllogism, and you take the predicate of this consequence, take the opposite of that, and cite that as the reason of the syllogism. You just turn it around and you get a correct syllogism. Now, if you haven't studied consequences and syllogisms in all their detail, this may be a little bit overwhelming, but never mind if you just understand that kind of uh, basic idea that a consequence, the way Buddha Palita looks at it, the way, but sorry, Bhava Viveka looks at it, is that whenever you have a consequence, you need to be able to change whatever it says around to make a correct statement. And that's only what Bhava Viveka asserts. Buddha Palita, as you will see, and Chandrakirti in particular, says that's not necessarily the case. The absurdities, it's not the case that when you point out an absurdity, the opposite is necessarily the case in general. That's not always the case. Okay. And that makes sense to us, even if someone comes up with fantasies. If we point out absurdities of their view, it's not always the case that the opposite of that absurdity is true in reality. Okay, we'll come to this. It's explained when Chandrakirti offers his defense of Buddha Palita. So, but the point is here with criticism number 3, Buddha Palita says that it's necessary to turn around production from the production from itself, the production from self. When you turn that around, when you negate that, in other words, when you negate that, you come up with production from other, which of course that's not the case, because production from itself is a non-affirming negative. Which means that according to the Prasangika Madhyamika school, it's extremely important that when you negate inherent existence, when you negate any kind of extreme, such as production from itself, production from something inherently other, when you negate any of these aspects, you just negate them, and nothing affirmative is suggested, because otherwise you will not be able to understand emptiness. If there is something affirmative, then whatever affirmative appears to the mind will always have this mistaken aspect. This is slightly difficult if you haven't studied philosophy to some degree. What may help you to understand is the fact that we our perception of reality always has this aspect of exaggeration, of always adding too much, which is why when we understand, when we try to refute, when we try to understand emptiness, we keep negating because we've already superimposed, we've added too much. Now, the process of understanding emptiness is a process of reversal, as in like refuting things. If you end up affirming things, if more things appear to you, you won't be able to refute emptiness, which is why it's so important when you refute production from itself, production from other, production from both. These four extremes, they are non-affirming negatives. Nothing appears to the mind in their place. But Baba Viveka says, according to Buddha Palita, if he cites these consequences, the consequences that things are because things are produced from themselves, taking that absurdity, because things are produced from themselves, therefore production is senseless and so forth. But Apalita thinks, Baba Viveka thinks you need to be able to accept the opposite. You need to now be able to have to refute, you have to negate production from itself. And when you do so, you affirm production from other. And that would contradict the Madhyamika view. Okay, so just to read it again, just as the predicate of Buddha Palika's, so Baba Viveka is saying, just as the predicate of Buddha Palika's consequence that production would be senseless and endless has to be reversed in order to cite the reason of a correct syllogism, because production is sensible and has an end. Likewise, the reason of the consequence, things are produced from themselves, must be reversed to things are produced from others. That's what Baba Viveka thinks. If you reverse things are produced from themselves, take the opposite, you end up with things are produced from others, to be cited as the predicate of the syllogism. However, Baba Viveka says this contradicts the Madhyamika tenet that the refutation of the four extreme types of production, production from self, from other, from both, and without a cause, is a non-affirming negation. For if the words things are not produced from themselves had to be things are produced from themselves. Sorry, if the words things are produced from themselves, again, as this not is extra, if these words, as part of the consequence, had to be reversed to things are produced from others, then these words would affirm that things are produced from others while negating that things are produced from themselves. They would affirm something. But that's only what Baba Viveka thinks. He only believes that if you cite a consequence, that's what Buddha Palita thinks. He believes a consequence is useless because you need to recite a syllogism. He made that very clear in his criticism number 1 and 2. And then in number 3, he's saying, moreover, if you cite a consequence, you have to accept the opposite of the consequence. And you end up with the opposite of production from itself is production from other. So therefore, if you negate production from itself, you're not just negating it without affirming anything. No, you're affirming production from others. And that is not what the Madhyamikas say. That is his third criticism. Okay, I hope this is a little bit clearer. Never mind, there are bits that you might find difficult, but if you get some general sense, that's sufficient. And now let's look at Chandrakirti's defense. Chandrakirti defends Buddha Palita's reasoning, okay, in his clear words. What I said, it's a word commentary on Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom. And again, I laid out the different criticisms by Baba Viveka, so we will be able to follow it. Just to remind you, Baba Viveka's first criticism that Buddha Palita does not cite a correct reason and an example as parts of an autonomous syllogism in order to refute the Samkhya position. Now, in response to that, Chandrakirti argues, an opponent in debate doesn't need a syllogism. I didn't say that, but it's implied. So an opponent in debate can come to understand that there's no production from self through citing consequences, which demonstrate the logical absurdities and inner contradictions that ensue from accepting that things are produced from themselves. So Baba Viveka's insistence on a correct reasons, it's not necessary. And that's what I said earlier on. With his consequences, Buddhapalita therefore shows that it is unreasonable to accept production from self, since the Samkhyas cannot find an example of something that is produced again after it has already been produced, or of something that is produced endlessly after it has already been produced. Okay, so it doesn't make sense. Therefore, production from itself, that they really think about it, and it's a process to leading them to these absurdities, to leading them to an understanding of those. It's not just you recite this consequence and you let them just sit there and think about it. It's a process within a debate, an ongoing kind of exchange where you, through these consequences, um, you slowly lead the other person to understanding that it follows this, it follows that, it follows this, and so forth. You slowly lead them to understand, oh, but it doesn't make sense if I accept this. And sometimes it's directly, you can directly lead them there, and sometimes it's indirectly. So this reflects really the process of debate. If, however, an opponent, no matter how you debate, however good reasons you recite, if, however, an opponent in debate persisted in his error, despite being presented with these logical absurdities, well, it would be pointless to state further reasons and examples of autonomous syllogisms. So Buddhapalita says, well, it's no, sorry, Chandrakirti says, well, it's helpful to have these consequences. In general, they can help, they can be much more effective. But if for some person, no matter what consequence, it's possible, some people, for the time being, they're not ready to hear this, and then you just let it go. So no matter how many consequences you cite, if they're not able to let go of their views, well, nothing will help. Then even the syllogism will not help them. So an autonomous syllogism doesn't help. And moreover, there are no autonomous syllogisms, Chandrakirti says, because autonomous is synonymous with inherently existent. And according to the Prasangika Madhyamika school, inherent existence is not tenable. All right. So therefore, having heard Viveka's first criticism, um, consequences are perfectly able to do what just described. And if that doesn't help, well, how could a syllogism A is not B because it's C? How could that help? How could Buddhapalita's syllogism help? Sorry, Bhava Viveka's syllogism, how could that be in any way more effective? And then in response to the next criticism, in response to this kind of analysis, what is exactly meant with production from self? Okay, so in response to Baba Viveka's second criticism that Buddhapalita's reasoning is not able to prove to the Samkhyas their mistaken view after the latter have analyzed the meaning of the thesis that things are not produced from themselves. So the thesis is things are not produced from themselves. So if they analyze that, Chandrakirti objects to Baba Viveka's syllogism, the one given before. I wrote it again in brackets, arguing that this syllogism would incur the same fault, the same fault that he says. It would not avoid, Baba Viveka's syllogism would not avoid the fallacy of proving what is already established for the Samkhya's. Okay, if things non-production from itself were to refer to non-production from itself that is manifest at the time of its cause. Remember, if you say, what does it mean, production from itself? If you were to say that the apple tree is already manifestly there within the seed, visible there. Now, some kids would say, no, of course not. We don't say that, right? So even if you recite Baba Viveka's syllogism, the one he provides, if you analyze that, and that's what it meant, if you want to prove that there's no production from itself, but what you mean is that there's no production of an apple seed, of an apple tree from a cause during which time the apple tree is already present. Well, some kids already believe that. There's no reason to prove that to them. They already established that. But if on the other hand, you mean that there's no ultimately production from self, so no production from self meant that there's no production from some prakriti, some nature, or some non-manifest existence of the apple tree in that sprout, well, the Samkhya's wouldn't let go of that. wouldn't assert. They would say, no, it is. There definitely is. So whatever reason you say, because it exists, will not prove to them that things have not arisen, that the apple seed, the apple tree has not arisen from this prakriti and so forth. That will not do it either. So whatever folds you saw in what Buddha Palita said, well, it applies to you in the same way. Okay. And then the third criticism. So basically, he's throwing number two, he's throwing back at Baba Viveka, saying that fold that you say Buddha Palita's supposed syllogism, which of course Buddha Palita never cited, that fold applies to the syllogism you cited anyway. And then regarding Baba Viveka's third criticism, that since it is necessary for Buddha Palita to assert the opposite of the predicate and the opposite of the reason of his consequences, which, according to Buddha Palita, contradicts the Madhyamika tenet that the refutation of the four extreme types of production is a non-affirming negation. With regard to that assertion, Chandrakirti argues, although consequences sometimes imply their opposite meaning, sometimes they imply their opposite meaning, this is not true for all consequences. When a consequence applies its opposite meaning, it applies a correct syllogism. That's possible. Okay, so to give you a classic example, the example that's given again and again, if you, for instance, believe your body is permanent, but your body is also a product of its own causes and conditions. And if at the same time you believe whatever is a product of its own causes and conditions must be impermanent, you can recite the following consequence. You can say, regarding the subject, my body, it follows it's not a product, right? You believe it's a product, but I say it follows that it's not a product because it is permanent. So you must assert that whatever is permanent is necessarily not a product, because you assert whatever is a product must be impermanent. Okay? And if you hold this view that the body is permanent, that it's at the same time whatever is a product must be impermanent, and whatever is permanent must not be a product, then it would be a correct consequence to say regarding the subject, your body, it follows it's not a product because it's permanent. All right. And that is a correct consequence because it points out this contradiction, that on one hand you say whatever is a product must be impermanent, whatever is permanent is necessarily not a product, but you still believe that the body is a product, but that it's permanent. So there's these contradictory view, and with this consequence you can point out this absurdity. And this consequence, if you turn it around regarding the subject, my body, it follows that it's not a product because it's permanent. You can take the reason permanent, take the opposite, impermanent, take the predicate of the consequence, it's not a product, take the opposite, make that product, and cite that as the reason. And then you have regarding the subject, my body, it is impermanent because it's a product, right? So in this case, you have a syllogism, you have a consequence which implies the opposite meaning, in which it implies the syllogism, but that's not true for every consequence. So Baba Viveka has this simplified version. He believes you always have to be able to assert the opposite of the absurdity. No, you don't have to do that. You go according to what the opponent believes. Okay, so therefore, when a consequence implies, some consequences do in fact imply their opposite meaning, it implies a correct syllogism with the opposite of the reason of the consequence being cited as the predicate of the syllogism, and the opposite of the predicate of the syllogism being cited as the reason. No, the opposite of the predicate of the consequence, it should say again. As I told you, I didn't have much time to do this, and there were a few mistakes in there. So it should rather be number one, the opposite of the reason of the consequence is cited as the predicate of the syllogism, and the opposite of the predicate of the consequence is cited as the reason of the syllogism. Okay, so I need to, yeah, that should be consequence. Okay, so yeah. Anyway, however, Buddha Palita did not state his two consequences to imply their opposite meaning. Okay, so the opposite of the predicate of the syllogism, yeah, never mind, you can't change it now. However, Buddhapalita did not state his two consequences to imply their opposite meaning, since the opposite of the predicate of the two consequences, what is the opposite? That things being produced again is sensible. That's the opposite of the consequence. So here it's an example. Things being produced again is sensible. Well, Buddhists don't accept that. And that things being produced again is not endless, because being produced again is accepted by the Samkhyas. So in essence, in meaning, the Samkhyas accept that it exists already and it's being produced again because it's already there. But that's not what the Buddhists assert. So the opposite of the consequence would be that things being produced again is sensible, and that things being produced again is not endless. That is the opposite of the consequence. But this is not in accordance with reality and is only asserted by the Samkhya's. All right. Okay. Now I'm pretty sure you're confused. I'm pretty sure not everything is clear. um, the reason I did this today was I didn't want to just ignore it. I don't want to spend a month on this. I don't think if we did a study course like Geshe Damdo, he offers this incredibly wonderful Nalanda study course. And there you have the opportunity to go through all this in great detail and understand it better. That's not the purpose of this class. Um, I want to go back to the text as of next class. I don't want to spend more time on this. Um, but I also didn't want to leave it incomplete in that this is considered to be a huge part. And however confusing this is, and however many, well, and there are some mistakes in the text that I definitely have to correct. Um, but however difficult it is, you did learn something, I believe, something that you take with you as a result of this, the technique of how, first of all, how to uh, apply a consequence, that a consequence points out absurdities, the opposite of which, however absurd it is, the opposite is not necessarily accepted in reality. It can go into such absurdity, you can go to such a degree that not even the opposite is something that we must accept. Um, so basically, it shows us that we can go into to great extent, to great into great details and great what's the word, extreme kind of consequences, just to bring another person to seeing the inner contradictions of their views, and that a correct reason, it is this A is B because it's C, that in itself is a simplified version. It's not as simple as that. So that's definitely something we take from this. I guess that's really the main message. And of course, here there are no autonomous syllogisms, which what Buddhapalita is also, well, what Chandrakirti is also saying is that the form of syllogism, Buddhapalita, what does Baba Viveka mean when he says there's an inherently autonomous syllogism? He believes that the parts of the syllogism, um, all the aspects of the syllogism, so the subject, which is the basis, the predicate, that which is to be proven, and then the reason, that there exist inherently and that they appear in the same way to both parties, the debate, the opponent and the person presenting the arguments. But that is not true. There's no inherently existent syllogism. And plus, especially when you debate emptiness, this is also another argument Chandrakirti makes, there's no commonly appearing object, uh, especially between the Prasangika and the Svatantrika school, because according to the Svatantrika school, whatever appears to, for instance, an eye consciousness, it appears as inherently existent, and it's correct. The eye consciousness is correct with regard to that appearance. But in the Prasangika school, that appearance is incorrect. There's a huge difference in that the Prasangika school says that although we can perceive a table, we can perceive other things, but these things, the way they appear, they don't exist. Whereas the Svatantrika school would say they do exist that way because inherently they exist inherently. They're dependent on the mind, but they still exist in and of themselves. So basically the Prasangika and the Svatantrika do not agree with regard to the object that appears to them when they debate. Okay, now this comes down to, of course, the Baba Viveka as a follower of the Svatantrika school, claiming that they're inherently existent syllogisms, they're autonomous syllogisms, and they're able to prove reality. And the Prasangika school says, no way. Okay, all right. Therefore, Prasangika school says things don't exist the way they appear to us. Svatantrika says they do with regard to the sense uh, objects. Sense objects appear to exist out there inherently. That's not true according to the Prasangika school. According to Svatantrika school, it is. According to the Svatantrika school, inherent syllogism has this ability to just prove to the other person they are wrong. According to the Prasangika school, there are no inherently existing syllogisms, and syllogisms are very limited. Consequences are necessary, and consequences can be so extreme that even their opposite is not accepted by the Buddhists. All right, okay. Today, I didn't make time for a meditation, and I definitely will do this next time again. But I just wanted to get it off the table, give you like a summarized version of this debate, which from now on, at least you've heard about it because it's mentioned over and over again as such a huge turning point where this differentiation between the Svatantrika and the Prasangika became more obvious, the difference between those two schools, which of course is helpful in the process of slowly understanding the deepest view of the Prasangika school. All right. And then next class, we leave this for now. I'll correct this handout that I've sent you. I'll correct the mistakes that I've found in there and resend it to Shir, and you can make it available to you. If you're interested, and maybe in the discussion group, of course, you may have to talk about it once again if you're interested. But that's it. And verse 14, it is for next time. And there's nothing more left for today than to dedicate the virtue we have accumulated in this process of trying to understand something that is extremely complicated, but like an exercise where we stretch maybe a little further than we're used to. It could have been painful because we're not used to stretching our mind to such a degree. But that next time when we hear about this again in a different context, it'll be easier. Our mind has already become more flexible. And may this help us to further widen widen our mind, make our mind more flexible, so that eventually we gain a better understanding that things do not exist the way they appear to us. The exaggerated way in which they appear to us, this is just an exaggeration that comes from our own mind, that is not found in reality. So may what we've learned today help us to deepen this wisdom, and at the same time, may the virtue we accumulated enable us to remove all the obstructions from our mind, to deepen our love and compassion for other sentient beings, so that we're able eventually to attain the fully enlightened state of a Buddha. And at the same time, whatever virtue we've accumulated today, may it even right now, at this point in time, affect the people around us, the world around us in a positive way. May it be the cause for those who experience fear and loneliness to overcome their problems. May those who are sick, like Tali Lubin and everyone else experiencing different diseases, quickly recover from their illness. And then, moreover, let's read the words of Shantideva to more effectively dedicate our virtue. May all beings everywhere plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. Most importantly, for as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain, to dispel the miseries of the world. And once again, for this week, please make your main practice, as already mentioned, especially when trouble arises, when you feel annoyed, insulted, experience fear, and so forth. Note that this is the issue, that this is the problem in that moment, and almost like taking a step back, remember, but I'm working for the welfare of all sentient beings. It's all right, because my main goal is to become a Buddha for the welfare of all sentient beings. All right, let's try that for this week, and then I see you again next week. Okay, have a great week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geshe. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Geshe-la.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Gute Nacht.
Leila Tov. Good night.
Thank
Leila Tov.
you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ebenso, gute Nacht.
Oh, ebenso.
Tschüss, Michael.
Ja, kommt.